In this lecture, we're going to talk about an introduction to biochemistry, which is the chemistry of living things. So to start that off, we first need to talk about carbon, because a majority of the compounds in living things are carbon-based compounds. And the things that I'm talking about would be carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Those are going to be the four macromolecules that we're going to be focusing on in this chapter. And all of those have carbon as their central backbone. So let's talk a little bit about carbon. So carbon has 4 valence electrons, and that's important because remember we talked in the previous chapter about how atoms typically want to have 8 valence electrons, and they will either gain, lose, or share electrons in order to have 8. So with carbon having exactly 4, what's going to make the most sense for carbon is going to be to share. It's going to be unlikely it's going to be able to gain or lose 4 electrons. But if it could say share with 4 hydrogens, now my carbon has 8. And not only does it share by making 4 bonds with 4 different things, but carbon is extremely flexible. It tends to make also double bonds, triple bonds. It can form rings, these large carbon rings. And so it can make all these different macromolecules that living things are composed of. So taking a look, this is just some of the things that carbon can do. So notice here, this is chains of carbon, ethane, propane, and these can be longer than that. Butene, this has a double bond. This is 2-butene, it has a double bond in a different spot. Here, this is branching, so carbons can actually make these branched structures, and then these are ring structures. Cyclohexane and benzene, notice this one has double rings. So are you going to have to draw these? No. But this is just to show you the flexibility, even if you just work with just carbon and hydrogen. So let's talk about what organic is. So you hear a lot about organic, like in the grocery store, oh, I want to buy only organic vegetables. That is not what we are talking about here. So organic technically means from life, or sometimes they think of from nature, and that's what they're referring to really in your grocery store. They're talking about like no pesticides were used, no genetic modifications were made, but that's not what we mean when we say organic in the science classroom. So to be organic, an organic compound is something that contains technically carbon and hydrogen. For example, your biology book will say that carbon dioxide is not an organic compound, even though it contains carbon, because it doesn't contain hydrogen. So organic, the reason that we started using the name is because originally these were compounds that were discovered in living things. They were compounds made only by living things. Today we know you can manufacture lots of carbon compounds in a lab that are not made from living things. However, the name organic sort of stuck, okay? So that's what organic refers to. So the backbone of these organic compounds is carbon and hydrogen, and so they're sometimes called hydrocarbons for hydrogen and carbon. Here's some examples. Now notice how these are written. You might say, why are these written out like that instead of like, why can't I just write this as C2H6? You can, but in organic chemistry, sometimes they'll write this to indicate that this is a chain. So for example, if you were to actually draw this out, see, they're saying that the first carbon has 3 hydrogens attached to it. And then the second carbon in the chain has 2 hydrogens attached to it. And then that third carbon in the chain has 3 hydrogens attached to it. So this is sort of a shorthand way of showing what's attached to each carbon. Keep in mind that hydrogen can only make 1 bond. So even though this is written that it almost looks like the hydrogens, like that you're looking at this, C to H to C, that cannot happen. Carbon can make 4 bonds, but hydrogen can only make 1. So the backbone of these is always going to be the carbons. The hydrogens are sort of taking up all the empty spaces in order to make 4 bonds. Now you could actually calculate the formula for a simple hydrocarbon, assuming it's just a chain of single bonds only. The formula would always be CN h 2n plus 2. So n is sort of like a variable like in math. So for example, let's say I said, hey, What's the formula for octane? It has 8 carbons. Well, then N would be 8. So it would be C8H 2N plus 2. So 2 times 8 plus 2. So 8 times 2 is 16 plus 2. The formula for octane would be C8H18. So that's how you could actually calculate the formula for a hydrocarbon. Now it turns out chains of hydrocarbons are very rich in energy. We're going to find that hydrocarbon chains are the biggest component of fats. And these long chains, they can be 40 carbons long, 50 carbons long. Just carbon and hydrogen in these long chains actually store lots and lots of energy, lots of calories. That's why fat has high in calories. It's got a lot of energy in it. Now here's the thing though, if all you had was carbon and hydrogen, it turns out that the carbon-hydrogen bond, this is a non-polar bond. So hydrocarbon chains tend to be hydrophobic. We talked about this in the last chapter. Hydrophilic likes water, hydrophobic doesn't. So gasoline, oil, wax, lard, butter, those things all contain chains of hydrocarbon. None of those dissolve in water. They are non-polar and they're repelled by water. But we are going to be talking about sugars and proteins and nucleic acids, and those things are not just hydrocarbons. What makes them unique is some of the hydrogens get replaced by these special things called functional groups. And these functional groups will be specific to different compounds. For example, amino acids always have an amino group, which is one of the functional groups. So when we talk about these different groups of compounds, sugars, the proteins, and whatnot, each one has specific functional groups that are found on it that give it specific properties. So today we're going to go through seven functional groups that are important in the chemistry of living things. So this slide is just sort of a preview, so let's just jump right in. Now, to clarify what I'm showing you here, if you're doing the outline for this class, the functional group itself is just this little thing in parentheses. That's the actual functional group. It is a group of elements stuck on a carbon of some kind, a carbon chain, a carbon ring, a carbon thing, and it's going to have a particular function. And we use the letter R in organic chemistry to represent the variable that it's connecting to. So this is some kind of carbon chain. It could be a carbon with 3 hydrogens, it could be a chain of carbons, it could be a ring of carbons, but it's definitely going to be a carbon and then some other things connected to that carbon. So you're going to see this letter R pop up in all of these functional groups, and I just wanted to clarify that. So the first functional group is called a hydroxyl group. This is not a negative sign, this is a dash. So a hydroxyl group is basically OH, an oxygen and a hydrogen, connected to some carbon compound. This is all you need for the notes. This picture at the bottom, and each slide will have one of these, is an example. So this is ethanol. This is the alcohol in alcoholic beverages. This is the alcohol we used at station 1 when you were heating and cooling, and in station 3 when you were in properties of water, you were dissolving the iodine, you used ethanol. This is ethanol. This is the hydroxyl group. This is R. This is what it's connected to. Now, another alcohol you used in the lab was isopropyl alcohol, or isopropanol. Isopropanol looks like this. Carbon with a bunch of hydrogens, and right here sticking off this middle one, an OH. This is the hydroxyl group. The rest of this here, all of this is R. This is what it's connecting to, the rest of the molecule. So this is actually not part of the functional group, but this could be stuck on anything. And that's what I want to clarify with the R. You could also have a carbon ring like this, and these are all carbons, carbon, 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 and stuck off here, an OH. That's a hydroxyl group connected to a carbon, in this case, a carbon ring. I'm not going to draw, we're going to run out of time if I try to draw this out completely. This would have hydrogens connected, but this would be a ring of carbons. So that is called a hydroxyl group. And typically things that have hydroxyl groups are called alcohols. Sorry. Okay, this is our second one. It's called a carbonyl group. Now technically the carbonyl group itself is this. It's carbon double bonded to oxygen. But this one's a little confusing because it's subdivided. There's actually two types of carbonyl groups depending on where it's located. So if the carbonyl group is somewhere in the middle of a carbon compound, it's not on the end, anywhere except the end, it's called a ketone. And this is the way we represent it. See how there's two R's here. So what we're saying here is there's a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, and then there's some kind of carbon compound on the left and some kind of carbon compound on the right. And here's an example, acetone, nail polish remover. This is the actual ketone, the carbonyl group. And notice how it's connected to carbons on either side. This doesn't have to just be single carbons. These could be chains or whatever. So if anywhere in a chain of carbons, you suddenly see sticking off of one of them, double bonded to an oxygen, that's a ketone, which is a type of carbonyl. The other one is called an aldehyde. An aldehyde is when the carbonyl group is on the end of a chain of carbons. So how is this different? So this is C, double bonded to O. There's an H here. Why is there a hydrogen here? Because it's on the end, and carbon has to make 4 bonds. This is a double bond. It's getting sloppy. And then it's connected to some kind of carbon thing. So in this case, this is the R. This is the remainder of the compound. And this is the aldehyde on the end. So both of these are carbon double bonded to oxygen. If it's in the middle of a carbon compound with carbons on either side, this is a ketone. If it's on the end, the right, the left, the top, but it's sticking off of a carbon compound like this, it's an aldehyde. Ketone, aldehyde. By the way, another example of an aldehyde is formaldehyde that they use to preserve things. Acetone is nail polish remover, so that's an example of a ketone. Okay, this is called a carboxyl, or sometimes it's called a carboxylic acid because in reactions, it tends to dump off this hydrogen and form an acid. So it's R, this is the thing it's connected to, carbon double bonded to oxygen, but with an OH. So it looks almost like you took a ketone and you combined it with hydroxyl. So it's carbon double bonded to oxygen, and OH here, connected to some kind of a carbon chain or compound. Again, this is not a bond, this is the connection. A shorthand way of writing this is just COOH. I have seen it written that way to save space. But physically, structurally, it would look like this. Acetic acid is an example. Vinegar, which contains acetic acid, is an example of something that has a carboxyl or carboxylic acid group attached to it. Our next one's a little easier. This is called an amino group. I say it's easier because it's the only one that's got nitrogen in it. So it's going to be some carbon compound, a chain, a ring, whatever, and sticking off of it, a nitrogen with 2 hydrogens. It could either be written this way, NH2, or it could actually be N, and then they structurally show those H's. And this is an example. In this compound, this is an amino group. Notice in this compound, there's also on the other side a carboxyl group, a carboxylic acid group. So both of those are there. This is called a sulfhydryl group. Again, connected to a carbon compound, it's just a sulfur and a hydrogen. Sometimes it's called a thiol. This is very important in proteins. So here's an example. You have a carboxyl group on one end of this molecule. You have an amino group here. And over here, this is the thiol or the sulfhydryl group. This is called a phosphate. Sometimes, I've never actually seen it written this way. I usually see it written this way. This is not negative, this is a connection. So this is what it's connected, and it's PO4. 4 oxygens, one's a double bond, the other 2 have negative signs on them. It doesn't have to be the top one. This is important in ATP, also in DNA. So this is a phosphate group. And last but not least, this is a methyl group. So CH3, notice here, this is a methyl group. And also here, notice this is an amino. So methyl can either be written as CH3 or drawn out with the 3 H's. This one is important in turning DNA off and on.